Part 1, The Lull. Chapter 1, The Unblinking Hour. The light inside Blackwood Manor was the color of bruised slate, perpetually winter dusk regardless of the clock or the season outside. It was a light that refused to fade, just as Elara refused to sleep. She had been 10 years old for decades. Her body was a roadmap of perpetual childhood, slender and slight, dressed always in the same faded blue cotton shift. But her eyes, those were ancient things. Wide, unblinking, the color of wet moss, they saw the house not as a structure of wood and stone, but as a breathing veil. Elara sat on the window seat of the north parlor, watching the Appalachian peaks bruise the sky. The mountains here were perpetually overcast, swallowing the sun whole, feeding the manor's gloom. Below them, tucked into the valley like a forgotten memory, was Havenwood. Havenwood used to murmur. It used to send up thin trails of smoke, punctuated by the faint, distant sounds of children playing or the clang of a shop door. Now it was sinking into an extreme, unsettling quiet, a quiet that was not peaceful but geological. Elara knew the quiet was the sickness. She felt it vibrating in the damp, decaying floorboards beneath her bare feet. And because she never slept, never once closed her eyes, not even for a flicker, she perceived the cost of that silence. The walls shimmered. At first, it was just heat distortion, a mirage visible only in her peripheral vision, faint, oily slicks in the air, pulling the edges of the room into strange, ephemeral shapes. Silas, the manor's ancient, bone-thin caretaker, called them the residual static, but lately the static had been gaining definition. Today, pressed against the ancient glass of the window, Elara didn't see a mirage. She saw a tall, vertical smear of deeper shadow, a patch of absolute black that seemed to absorb the already meager light. It stretched, then settled, resting against the pane like a cold breath. Elara did not move. She merely watched, her lips parted slightly, her ceaseless awareness the only thing keeping the apparition pinned at the edge of reality. Chapter 2, The Slow Death of Havenwood. Sheriff Brody had been serving Havenwood for 25 years, and every year felt heavier than the last. The town wasn't dying, it was dissolving. Businesses shuttered, neighbors moved away without farewells, and the very air seemed to thin, taking the smell of rain and pine with it. He sat in his cruiser, parked near the desolate town square, filling out reports that detailed less and less activity. He was a man worn thin, his practicality clashing violently with the town's encroaching emotional void. Tonight, Brody was restless. A familiar anxiety, cold and sharp, was beginning to burrow into his chest. Miles above him, wrapped in the skeletal arms of the manor, Silas was performing his nightly ritual. He was nearly 90, possibly older, his skin like stretched parchment over sharp bone. He moved through the echoing halls with a lamp, touching the carved symbols etched generations ago into the lintels and door frames. He was reinforcing the wards. Silas knew the quiet below was an invitation. He also knew its focal point was upstairs, eternally 10 years old, watching. He paused outside Elara's room, his breath catching in a wheeze. His great-grandfather had been caretaker before him, and the duty was a penance woven into their lineage. The journal, the thick, leather-bound volume kept locked in the hearth-safe, held the truth. Elara was not just afflicted by sleeplessness. She was cursed with perpetual perception, perpetually holding the door to the quiet open just enough for things to press against it. Silas heard a sound that night, the faint, distant wail of a mother from the town below, a sound that tasted like despair. Chapter 3, The First Void. The child's name was Leela Vance. She had been playing hide-and-seek near the edge of the woods, right where the manicured lawns of Havenwood became the tangled path toward Blackwood. Sheriff Brody arrived to find the mother hysterical, pointing at a small patch of churned earth. Leela's skipping rope lay discarded, but the child herself was simply absent. There was no struggle, no forced entry, no footprint, no scent for the dogs to track. Just a void of silence where a small girl should have been. It was the first time Havenwood had suffered such a clean, efficient erasure. Brody went up to Blackwood Manor the next morning, driven by a desperate, illogical instinct. He found Silas sweeping a corridor, muttering spells under his breath. "Silas, you hear anything strange last night?" Brody asked, trying to keep his voice steady. Silas stopped sweeping, his dark eyes focusing somewhere past Brody's shoulder. "The absence of things, Sheriff. We hear only the absence." Brody stared at the manor, its rotting majesty dwarfing them both. He saw Elara, pressed against her north window, watching the woods below. He approached the window and looked up at the girl. Her eyes, wide and tireless, fixated on him for a moment before she raised a small, trembling hand. She didn't point at the woods or the house. She pointed at the air itself, at a spot just inches from where Leela Vance had disappeared. Brody saw nothing but the early morning mist. Elara's voice, a thin, breathy sound, finally broke the silence she so keenly felt. "Deeper," she whispered. "The shadow is deeper there." Brody, a man of empirical evidence, felt an old dread take root. The shadow Elara described wasn't an object, it was a quality. Chapter 4, The Historian's Alarm. Maeve Harper was the last bastion of true intellectual curiosity in Havenwood. A local historian in her late 20s, she had dedicated her life to cataloging the town's folklore before it was swallowed by apathy. The vanishing of Leela Vance galvanized her. She wasn't concerned with who took the child, but why the town was so quiet about it. The reaction was muted, fearful, a slow collapse into silence. Maeve spent 3 days buried in the dusty municipal archives, comparing this phenomenon to ancient accounts. She found repeated references to a creature associated not with blood or fire, but with absolute quiet. The Whisper Man, the records called it, an entity invoked during times of famine, plague, and especially prolonged, unnatural decay. It didn't take life. It stole sound, then memory, then definition. It flourished where silence bred despair. The common thread in the accounts led her inexorably, terrifyingly, back to Blackwood Manor. It was always described as the beacon on the hill, where the perpetual vigil held the balance. Maeve, a lifelong skeptic, read the final, faded description. It manifests in the wake of the stillness, drawn to the singular perception that refuses quiet. She felt the cold reality beneath her skepticism shatter. The silence in Havenwood wasn't a coincidence. It was a symptom. And the manor, with its perpetually wakeful sentinel, was the target. Part 2. The Coalescence. Chapter 5. The Rustle of Ash. The entities were no longer shy. Elara, perpetually alert, watched them take shape in the corners of her room. They were like inverse shadows, areas where the existing darkness became more dark. They moved like smoke caught in a breath, flickering at the edge of her vision, always tall and indistinct. They pressed their forms against the antique furniture, leaving behind a cold that smelled faintly of rust and dust. Now she heard them. It wasn't a voice. It was a sound like dry leaves dragged across stone, or the continuous rustling of burnt ash. A sound that reached only her ears, boring into her sleepless mind. Watch, see, stay. They were drawn to her, feeding on the constant energy of her awareness. Her sleeplessness wasn't just holding the door ajar. It was a blazing lamp in a field of night, and they were the moths of the void. Silas, sensing the increased density of the air, was nearly undone by panic. He spent his days in the sub-level library, frantic, reinforcing the manor's archaic wards with salt and iron, his hands shaking so violently he nearly dropped the precious leather journal. He turned its brittle pages until he reached a sequence of crude drawings and hurried script detailing the arrival of the Whisper Man decades ago. It warned that the creature's full manifestation required a specific catalyst, the complete consumption of a conscious, perceiving mind, and Elara, always awake, was the highest prize. Chapter 6. Migration. The disappearances multiplied, not just children now, but adults, a middle-aged shopkeeper, a retired fisherman. They didn't leave notes or bodies. They simply ceased to occupy space. The town's population didn't just shrink. Its memory of those people began to dim, as if the Whisper Man was already beginning its slow work of erasure. Sheriff Brody was losing the fight against disbelief. He had no suspects, no motive, and no physical evidence. He had only the growing reports from the few remaining terrified residents, reports of shadow people moving through the abandoned streets, always heading north, always toward Blackwood Manor. Brody drove up the winding leaf-choked road, the silence intensifying until his own heartbeat sounded like a drum in his ears. He needed Silas, if only to anchor his sanity to something outside of police procedure. He parked near the wrought iron gates, stepping out into the cold air. That's when he saw it. It wasn't a person, nor was it a distortion. It was a column of pure, concentrated shadow, gliding silently past the trees. Then another, and another. They moved with a disturbing lack of friction, flowing up the mountain road like black mercury. They were migrating. Chapter 7. The Convergence. Maeve found Silas first. She arrived at the manor with a stack of photocopied archival pages, her face pale with the terror of belief. Silas, hunched over a heavy oak table, scraping an ancient binding paste onto a doorframe, looked up, his eyes bloodshot. "You read the books," he stated, not asking. "The Whisper Man," Maeve whispered, the name catching in her throat. "It takes existence. It thrives on the quiet." Silas nodded grimly, gripping his journal. "And Elara is the gateway. She sees them. She hears them. Her constant awareness keeps the curtain pulled back just enough." He pointed to the final frantic entry etched in the brittle leather. "If the witness sleeps, the stillness will be absolute." A car crunched on the gravel outside. Sheriff Brody stumbled through the front door, his face etched with disbelief and fear. "They're coming," Brody gasped, leaning against the doorframe. "The shadows. I saw them, dozens of them, heading here." The air pressure dropped violently. The three adults looked at each other, their skepticism and practicality burnt away by shared, immediate dread. In the vast, silent main hall, Elara stood alone. Her eyes were fixed on the great arched windows overlooking the valley. The shadows were no longer outside. They were pressing against the glass, distorting the shapes of the ancient ivy until it seemed to writhe with malicious intent. Silas screamed and bolted, grabbing the last of his iron filings. He began frantically spreading the material across the main threshold, chanting words in a language so old it sounded like breaking stone. Then the power failed. The manor plunged into an oppressive near darkness, illuminated only by the faint, icy light filtering weakly through the shadowed windows. The collective fear of the three intruders, Silas's primal terror, Brody's shocked disbelief, and Maeve's historical horror acted as the final irresistible lure. The shadows poured in. Part 3. The Vigil. Chapter 8. The Breach. The air grew impossibly cold, heavy with a new suffocating silence. It was the silence before the scream, the void that precedes annihilation. The shadows that slipped through the unwarded windows and coalesced in the main hall were no longer just distortions. They were gaunt, featureless figures, man-shaped and yet utterly alien. They moved with the grace of slow-motion water, their presence draining the atmosphere of heat and sound. They were the drones, the vanguard of the Whisper Man. They moved toward Elara, who was standing perfectly still in the center of the hall, her arms held rigid at her sides, her eyes reflecting the unending gloom. Silas, seeing the entities surge past his meager barrier, let out a desperate, guttural cry, a sound of ancient failure. Then the Whisper Man manifested fully. It detached itself from the deepest shadow near the grand staircase. It was a man-shaped silhouette of pure, consuming void, taller than any man, a hole in reality. Where its face should have been, there was only a maw of absolute sucking silence. It seemed to inhale the last vestiges of light in the room, creating an unnatural gloom that clung to their skin. It moved with terrible, focused speed toward the gateway, toward Elara. It was aiming not for her life, but for her consciousness, the ceaseless perception it needed to fully anchor itself in this world. "No!" Silas shrieked, wrenching a small, oxidized amulet from a chain around his neck. It was small, glowing faintly with a residual, ancient blue-white light, a life-force-fueled ward meant to close the doorway at the cost of the user's vitality. With a final, desperate heave, Silas hurled the amulet toward Elara. Chapter 9. The Anti-Silence. The amulet struck Elara's chest, its sudden, painful jolt of energy momentarily shattering the cold spell around her. The Whisper Man recoiled slightly, its form flickering, but it surged again, sensing the imminence of its goal. Decades of ceaseless awareness, of watching the slow, creeping horror, of listening to the rustling whispers, had built up not just dread, but a raw, elemental pressure behind Elara's eyes. She did not scream from pain or childish terror. She screamed from the terror of final silence. It was a sound born of decades of unspent dread, a piercing, primal sound that vibrated through the foundation of the manor, through the core of the mountain itself. It was the sound of a gateway violently slammed, the sound of anti-silence. The shock wave hit the entities like a physical blast. The shadows staggered, their forms momentarily dissolving into smoke. The Whisper Man halted, a slight deformation rippling across its void-like surface, wounded by the sheer raw noise. Sheriff Brody reacted instantly, driven by instinct. He emptied his service pistol into the approaching figures. The bullets passed through the gaunt shapes, leaving only cold air in their wake, slamming into the wall without slowing the entities down. Maeve, huddled near the library door, gripped the old tome she had brought. Her terrified eyes scanned the text, finding only fragmented, desperate verse. She began to chant, reciting the forgotten, hopeful lines, throwing the energy of her desperate will against the oppressive silence. The Whisper Man, recovering swiftly, focused its terrible attention back on the child. It was weakened, but relentless. Its maw of silence opened wider, reaching out to engulf Elara, to steal the singular light of her constant mind. Chapter 10. The Price of Vigil. The battle ended abruptly. Elara's scream, while agonizing to utter, had bought them time. The amulet, having spent the last of Silas's waning life force, pulsed one final blinding flash of blue energy. The Whisper Man melted back. It did not flee in defeat, but retreated in strategic withdrawal, its form dissolving back into the deepest shadows of the main hall. As it retreated, it took a measurable portion of the manor's light with it, leaving the atmosphere impossibly darker, the silence now humming like a high-tension wire. The featureless figures dissolved back into the walls, leaving behind only the unbearable cold. Brody rushed to Silas, who had collapsed onto the cold stone floor, his body shaking violently. The old man was gravely wounded, not by a physical blow, but by the draining of his very essence. Silas's hand, gnarled and frail, pointed toward the fallen leather journal, which had spilled open on the floor. Brody knelt, reading the final, chilling entry written in a panicked, ancient hand. The gateway remains open. The ward merely bought time. The witness is the anchor, the lock. She must never sleep. Silas expelled a rattling breath and went quiet, his eyes still fixed on the ceiling. Elara stood trembling, her chest aching where the amulet had struck, her ears ringing, not with sound, but with the echo of her own sonic assault. She was unharmed physically, but irrevocably changed. Her eyes, wider than ever before, focused on the deep, lingering shadows woven into the fabric of the room. She no longer just saw the entities, she felt them, heard their silent, scratching whispers constantly, an internal roar of nothingness that would never cease. Chapter 11. The Final Silence. Havenwood was truly dead now. The few remaining residents, those who had not been taken, had been hollowed out. They moved soundlessly, their faces blank, their memories already beginning to thin and fade. The town was reduced to a collection of silent, vacant husks waiting for the final erasure. Silas was gone, buried quickly near the manor's ancient boundary line. Brody, utterly broken by the impossible truth, had tried to leave, but the road back down the mountain seemed to stretch endlessly under the perpetual cloud cover. He returned to the manor, a silent sentinel by the fire, his gun useless, his law meaningless. Maeve remained, driven by a historian's desperate urge to record the end of things, reciting fragments of protective verse whenever the pervasive silence became unbearable. But the central, terrible vortex remained Elara. She was trapped in the decaying mansion, her cursed eternal wakefulness, her profound torment, and their only remaining defense. The Whisper Man was undefeated, its presence lingering in Havenwood like a constant, cold hum of nothingness. She walked the halls now with her awareness stretched taut, every fiber of her being devoted to keeping the door violently shut. She was the sentinel, the perpetual witness. Elara stood vigil at the north window. The shadows just beyond the glass were no longer vague. They were dense, fluid, and active, writhing with a silent, patient hunger. They were closer than ever, a black sea pressing against the fragile barrier of reality, waiting for her to falter, waiting for the world to finally, completely fall silent. Elara, the child who never sleeps, watched them back, always waiting, always awake. The end.